the biggest threat to our mental health isn't what we think it is. The biggest threat to our mental health is collectivism, is the collective mind of all of our fellow human beings. There's a kind of a paradox here. We need other people, but when everyone joins up and sings off the same hymn sheet and becomes part of the group mind, part of the collective, then that is bad for our health. So we need people, but we also don't need to plug into the Borg entity, which is society. We can talk about this in terms of interiority and exteriority. So exteriority is when everything takes place on the outside and nothing that happens on the inside is of any real interest at all. So generally speaking, the type of world we live in is absolutely orientated towards the external life. We imagine that we have an interior life. Most of us would imagine that we have an interior life, but that so-called interior life is really an extension of the external. In other words, our inner reality is a faithful continuation of what goes on in the outside. So even when we're on our own and there's loads of stuff going through our head, that's just an extension of the external life inside of us. It's not the interior life. The interior life, what gets to be called interiority sometimes, is interiority only if it is discontinuous with the external life. In other words, it is not in any way, shape or form a reflection of it. It has nothing to do with it. It's kind of like being in your own world, as people say. It's not entirely the best way to put it probably, but it does give a sense of what I'm talking about. That there is no connection. We do not build our inner life on what we have absorbed from the outside world, but rather the inner life happens in complete independence. It doesn't give a hoot for what goes on the outside. It is completely and utterly independent. And so you've got two things. You've got the outer life and the inner life. Now, this idea wouldn't seem at all strange to, say, a Jungian psychotherapist, because that's what Jung was saying all along. But it does come as a type of surprise to most of us, because we imagine that our thoughts and our hopes and our dreams and everything else constitutes an inner life, but it doesn't. That's just what has been put into our head. Actually, our inner life has been squashed or repressed by all of this crass externality, which has nothing to do with us. It has to do with the way we have collectively agreed to understand the world, but nothing to do with how we ourselves actually see things or perceive things. That is, our own unique personal way of seeing things is elbowed out of the way to make place for the generic way. That's how socialization works. It's like the invasion of the body snatchers. We get possessed by this thing that is the group mind, that is the generic mind. And this is pretty horrific thing, really, since to be possessed or occupied by the generic mind is to suffer an inner death. There's no two ways about it. The host has to die so that the parasite can continue with its life cycle. Of course, we don't die physically, we continue to walk around. But as we walk around, we're doing the business of the generic mind, not our own. So we're like a unit that is being used. So obviously, if we have a job and we're working somewhere, we're kind of like a rented unit that does work for our employers. But then we get off work and we come home, and that's we're not on the clock anymore. But when it's the generic mind we're talking about, we're always the property of the generic mind. And we forget who we are. And when some vestigial sense or any sort of sense comes to us that is more in keeping with our true inner self, as far as we're concerned, it's an alien invader. It doesn't belong because we're looking at it from the point of view of the generic self. So we've been turned against ourselves very, very effectively. This process is easy to see happening. We can see it happening in the playground where people are bullied for not being like everyone else, and we quickly learn to be like everyone else, because if there's some sign or vestige of individuality comes out, all the other chickens will peck us. So if we possibly can, we will ape what they're saying and what they're doing and how they're thinking, and we'll take on their opinions, and then we won't get pecked to death. Makes perfect sense. Nobody wants to get pecked to death. So the system imprints us via bullying, and this shouldn't come as too much of a strange concept. It's exactly what happens in every process of indoctrination or enculturation. You can see it in a very neat form when we're talking about the process of becoming a soldier. So when we're first drafted, there's a whole business where we get broken down, shouted at on the parade ground, put through all of this stuff. And then when we've been broken down, we are reassembled in the shape of what the army wants a soldier to be. So we're remade in the army's own image. And that's normal, that's how it works. We get broken down and then we get rebuilt in the image of the system. The reason this is dangerous is because inner death is not a good thing. At the risk of stating the very, very obvious. But what happens with inner death? What happens when we lose that spark, when we lose our true individuality? And the curious thing is actually that we manage to carry on seeming so well for the most part in this situation. That's the really curious thing. How the hell do we do that? An awful lot of us do that. And as far as appearances go, it doesn't seem to be the case that we suffer unduly. Okay, there is no doubt that we would live much more authentically if we were who we truly were instead of who society says we are. But we don't know about that. We don't know that we're not living authentically, so we kind of get on quite happily. And if anyone were to say you're missing out, by living a second-hand life, that wouldn't make much sense. And for the most part, it is possible to live the conditioned life, the life which is mapped out for us, without suffering any immediate or acute hardship from it. But really what's happening is that we're put in a position where we have to deliberately not pay attention to all the warning signs. So there's no doubt there are warning signs, that there are feelings, that there are intimations that something isn't right. But we have a vast array of distractions and displacement mechanisms to take care of that. And those distractions and displacement mechanisms, which are to a large extent make up what society is all about, a system of distraction from the pain that being in society causes. And it can't, as I was saying, that works well enough. For some people, it doesn't work though. Some people, for some of us, we can no longer distract ourselves from these warning signs, from the intimations that all is not well. And that is what has used to be called neurotic mental illness. Only clearly it isn't an illness at all. The illness is the generic mind, not the fact that we suffer as a consequence of being possessed by the generic mind. That the feelings of whatever we're feeling, whether it's anxiety or depression or unworthiness or feelings of shame, guilt, low self-esteem, not fitting in, alienation, not being what you should be, all of that is only natural given the fact that our true identity, well, our true, rather than say identity, our true nature, because identity implies something fixed. Our true nature doesn't have to be fixed, it's just our nature, has been thrown out of the nest like just as a baby cuckoo will throw all the mother bird's real chicks out of the nest or eggs out of the nest. So too does the imposter, false self, throw who we truly are out of the nest. So what we're looking at here is kind of brutal, really. There is an absolute, utter brutality to the business of socialization. If we do become socialized successfully, the best we can hope for in that case is a life in which we never experience anything from an authentic basis, or whatever kind of life that would be. The only type of good feeling we can have is not one that comes from the core of our being, but one that comes from the outside in terms of societal validation. This is why when we're members of society, we need approval so much, because there's no good feeling coming from the inside. There may not be any acute bad feeling, but there's no inner good feeling, because that comes from the outside, just like everything else. So if I was able to adapt successfully to society and excel in the type of activities that society officially recognizes as being important and right and meaningful, then I could get a lot of external validation. So that's the best I could look for. A life of success with lots and lots of validation from everybody. That's the very best. And generally we call that being a winner or being a success, and we generally consider that to be the bee's knees. What could be better than that? Or that glorious adulation and everyone thinking we're great. So we think we're great too because everyone else does, and so all's good. Most of us wouldn't be able to see anything better than being a success in whatever form that success might take. But when we look at what we're actually saying here is that the best we can possibly hope for is to get a big dose of external validation on a pretty much continuous basis, because it can't just happen to once. It's got to keep on happening. Otherwise, we start to feel a bit empty, a bit worthless, a bit unsure of ourselves. So we need continuous external validation, and that creates a surrogate for well-being. It's not really well-being, because genuine well-being comes from the inside. This is an external version of well-being that comes from the outside. So obviously, that is like being dependent upon a drug to feel good. It is the same thing as being dependent upon a drug to feel good, to keep the existential angst away. But even though that we could say that would be an okay life, to be super successful and validated at every turn, that doesn't actually happen for hardly anybody. And even when you do make it and get positive feedback, that can just as easily turn around and become blame instead of praise. As is well known, that's what happens to people who are in the public eye. They get adulated and they get blamed, and that's pretty much what we can expect. So in that case, it's not so great after all, because in as much as we are vulnerable to external validation, we are also vulnerable to external devalidation. So it's all in all, it's not a great situation. And then for the vast majority of us, we can't expect to be successful at all, because only a few people can be successful. So that we go around being down on ourselves because of that, because we'd like to be successful, we'd like the validation, but we're not getting it. And yet at the same time, we're not getting the feeling that comes from the inside, the good feeling that comes from the inside, which isn't like validation, but it's just a feeling of not needing to prove yourself, or a feeling of not having to check up on yourself to see if everything's okay. So really, it's a type of freedom from that. So rather than calling it a good feeling, because that makes us think of euphoria, it's more like an actual experience of being alive. The feeling of being free and not having to check up on yourself the whole time in a neurotic way is just being alive. So there's no need to make a big deal of it or use mystical kind of fancy terminology. It's just being alive. And all sorts of things can happen within that realm, obviously. But the point is that very straightforward business of being born and then being alive doesn't happen as easily as we might think. As Rumi says, all of us will know death, but only a few of us will know life.